Some women spend their whole lives building walls around their hearts, only to realize too late that they've locked themselves inside. Cordelia Whitmore has everything money can buy, but at 58, she's never had the one thing that truly matters: someone to leave it all to. She's the richest woman west of the Mississippi, with shipping empires and railroad lines stretching across the continent. But her mansion echoes with loneliness, and her fortune feels hollow without an heir to carry on her name. When she travels to a wild mountain territory she once bought on a whim, she meets Jeremiah Crow, a mountain man who's never owned more than he can carry, never worn shoes in summer, never read a single book. Yet when he looks at her with ancient eyes and whispers, "I can smell you're ready for sons," everything she thought she knew about power and legacy crumbles. Can a woman who conquered Wall Street surrender to something far more primitive and real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver locket had been her mother's, the only thing Cordelia Whitmore owned that couldn't be measured in dollars or traded on any exchange. She held it now in the dim gaslight of her Fifth Avenue mansion, studying the faded daguerreotype. Inside, a young woman with hopeful eyes and soft cheeks, nothing like the sharp-featured empress of commerce she'd become. "Will there be anything else tonight, Miss Whitmore?" Winston's voice carried the gentle authority of 30 years in her service. At 72, he was the closest thing to family she had left, though neither would ever speak such sentiment aloud. "No, Winston, thank you." She closed the locket with a soft click. "Actually, yes. Bring me the deed box from the safe, the one marked Colorado Territory." His eyebrows rose a fraction, the only surprise he ever allowed himself to show. "The Colorado properties, miss?" "There's only one property. Winston, a tract of wilderness I purchased 15 years ago during that railroad speculation." She moved to the tall windows overlooking the gas-lit streets below, where carriages rolled past, carrying New York's elite to their evening entertainments. "I never did find out what exactly I bought." Winston returned with a mahogany box, its brass fittings gleaming despite years of neglect. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the deed to 3,000 acres of mountain territory near a settlement called Copper Creek. The paper felt strange in her hands, rough and primitive compared to the crisp contracts that usually crossed her desk. She'd built her empire from nothing, starting with the single shipping vessel her father left behind when consumption took him. That was 35 years ago, when she was 23, and the business world viewed women as decorative ornaments, rather than serious competitors. They'd learned differently. Her father, God rest his soul, had been different from other men of his generation. "Cordelia," he'd told her during those long nights when illness kept him wakeful, "a man builds his legacy in his sons, but you'll have to build it in steel and stone, in contracts and corporations. Make them so strong they'll outlast any bloodline." She'd taken his words as gospel. While other women her age were planning weddings and nurseries, Cordelia was studying shipping manifests and railroad schedules. She learned to read men's faces across negotiating tables, to spot weakness in their eyes, and exploit it with surgical precision. She'd bought failing businesses and made them profitable, acquired shipping routes that others deemed worthless, and slowly, methodically, built an empire that stretched from the Atlantic ports to the growing cities of the West. The business journal lay open on her desk, leather-worn smooth by decades of her hand, pages filled with neat columns of figures and terse notes about acquisitions, mergers, and calculated risks that had paid off handsomely. Every page represented another victory, another step up the ladder of power and influence. But lately, victory tasted like ash in her mouth. "Winston," she called. He appeared instantly, as he always did. "How old am I?" 58 years. 4 months and 12 days, miss. "And in all that time, what have I built that will matter when I'm gone?" The question hung in the air between them. Winston had served in her father's house before her, had watched her transform from a grief-stricken girl into the most formidable businesswoman in America. If anyone could answer honestly, it was he. You've built an empire that employs thousands. Miss ships that carry goods to every corner of the continent, railways that connect cities that never existed when you were young, all of which will be sold and scattered the moment I draw my last breath. She picked up the deed again, running her thumb along its rough edge. No children to inherit, no family name to carry forward. Just a fortune that will make lawyers rich and be forgotten within a generation. Winston's silence was answer enough. Tut. Decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on a winter pond. She'd spent decades in boardrooms and offices, surrounded by the finest things money could buy, yet she felt as barren as the autumn trees outside her window. Perhaps it was time to see what her money had purchased in that distant wilderness. Not as an investment, but as something else entirely. Winston, send word to the station. I'll be taking the private car west next week. To Chicago, miss. Beyond Chicago. To Colorado Territory. The journey took 4 days in her private railroad car, a masterpiece of carved walnut and green velvet that had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. She watched the landscape change through windows that filtered the harsh American sunlight into something more suitable for refined eyes. Cities gave way to farmland, farmland to prairie, and finally prairie to the first jagged peaks of mountains that seemed to scrape the very belly of heaven. Copper Creek turned out to be little more than a trading post and a handful of rough buildings scattered along a stream that ran silver bright in the morning sun. Her car was the finest thing these people had ever seen, and they gathered to stare as she stepped onto the wooden platform in her traveling dress of midnight blue silk. "You'd be Miss Whitmore," said a weathered man in a storekeeper's apron. "Name's Bill Hawkins. I run the general store. Heard tell you own some property hereabouts. 3,000 acres, according to the deed." She looked around at the primitive settlement, so different from the paved streets and gas lamps of civilization. "I thought I might survey what I've purchased." Hawkins scratched his grizzled chin. "That'd be up in the high country, miss. Rough territory, not much up there but trees, rocks, and wild things. And perhaps one man wilder than the rest," added a voice from the small crowd. A woman in a faded calico dress stepped forward. "Begging your pardon, but if your land runs up toward Eagle's Peak, you might cross paths with Jeremiah Crow." "Who is Jeremiah Crow?" The woman glanced at the others before answering. "Mountain man, lives up there somewhere, though nobody's seen his cabin. Comes down maybe twice a year for supplies. Keeps to himself mostly. Some say he's been up there since the war ended." "Harmless enough," Hawkins added quickly. "Just particular about his privacy. Mountain folk tend to be that way." Cordelia nodded, filing the information away. She'd dealt with difficult men before. Politicians, railroad barons, mining magnates, who thought their crude manners and loud voices could intimidate her. A hermit in the wilderness hardly seemed threatening. She took rooms at the only hotel, a 2-story building with walls so thin she could hear every conversation in the adjoining rooms. The bed was a far cry from the silk sheets and down mattresses of her Fifth Avenue home. But something about the simple furnishings and plain wooden floors felt oddly comforting. That first night, she stood on the small balcony outside her room and breathed air that tasted of pine and snow and something else. Something wild and untamed that her civilized lungs had never known. The stars overhead burned with an intensity impossible in the gas-lit sky above New York, and for the first time in years, Cordelia Whitmore felt small, but not diminished. There was a difference, though she couldn't yet name what it was. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on her window. She dressed carefully in her most practical traveling clothes, still silk, still finely tailored, but at least suitable for walking outdoors. The silver locket hung warm against her throat, her mother's gentle face hidden but somehow present. Bill Hawkins had arranged for a local guide, a grizzled prospector named Pete, who knew every trail in the territory. "Your land starts about 5 miles up that ridge," he explained, pointing toward a pine-covered slope that seemed to climb straight into the clouds. "We can ride most of the way, but the last mile or so gets pretty rough." They set out on horses. Cordelia had ridden in Central Park, of course, but never on anything more challenging than well-groomed bridle paths. The mountain trail tested every muscle she possessed, and by midday her elegant riding habit was dusty and torn. But something extraordinary was happening. With each mile that separated her from civilization, she felt a strange lightness in her chest, as if invisible chains were falling away link by link. The business journal remained in her hotel room, along with the telegrams from her New York office that arrived daily demanding her attention. Up here, surrounded by trees that had been growing since before America was even dreamed of, corporate mergers seemed less urgent than the flight of an eagle overhead. They crested a ridge, and Pete pointed into a valley below where a stream meandered, between stands of aspen already touched with autumn gold. "That's your land, miss. Runs from that big rock formation clear down to where the stream bends." Cordelia dismounted and walked to the edge of the ridge. Her land. 3,000 acres of wilderness that had never known a plough or a surveyor's chain, never been divided into lots or parcels for development. It stretched before her like a green tapestry woven by God's own hand, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt tears threatening. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and the words seemed inadequate. Beautiful was a silk gown or a well-appointed drawing room. This was something else entirely, something her vocabulary of commerce and contracts had no word for. "Yes, ma'am," Pete agreed. "About as pretty as it gets in these parts. You thinking of building something up here?" The question struck her oddly. Build something? Her first instinct was yes, a hotel perhaps, or a hunting lodge for wealthy Easterners seeking adventure. That's what she'd always done with land, improved it, developed it, made it profitable. But standing there in the mountain silence, with wind moving through the pines like God's own whispered benediction, the idea felt like sacrilege. "No," she said finally. "I don't think so." They rode down into the valley, following game trails that seemed as old as time itself. The silence was different from any she'd known. Not the dead quiet of an empty office building, but a living silence full of hidden sounds. Birds called from invisible perches, streams murmured secrets to the stones, and somewhere in the distance, something large moved through the underbrush. As the afternoon wore on, Pete grew increasingly nervous. "We should head back soon, miss. Don't want to get caught up here after dark." "Why, are there bears?" "Bears, sure, mountain lions too. But that's not what worries me." He glanced around uneasily. "This is Jeremiah Crow country. He don't take kindly to trespassers, even on someone else's land. You said he was harmless." "Harmless don't mean friendly, and he's got ways of making. Folks understand they ain't welcome without showing himself direct." As if summoned by their conversation, a sound echoed across the valley, low, haunting, and utterly inhuman. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, raising the hair on Cordelia's arms, despite her practical nature. Pete's horse shied, and his face went pale. "Wolf," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just a wolf." The sound came again, closer this time, and Cordelia felt something stir deep in her chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. As if some part of her that had been sleeping for years was finally awakening. "We're going back," Pete announced, turning his horse toward the ridge. "Right now." But as they rode away from her wilderness paradise, Cordelia found herself looking back over her shoulder, searching the tree line for some glimpse of the man who lived like a ghost in her forest. She saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches, yet she felt watched, studied, measured by eyes she couldn't see. That night, in her simple hotel room, with its plain wooden walls and rough-hewn furniture, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silver locket lay cool against her throat, her mother's face hidden in darkness, but somehow present, approving. For 35 years, she'd built walls around her heart, just as she'd said. walls of ambition and achievement, of respectability and rigid self-control. But tonight, those walls felt less like protection and more like prison bars. Something was calling to her from that wilderness, something her civilized mind couldn't name or catalogue or control. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return to her forest alone. The storm came out of nowhere, as mountain storms often do, turning the October sky from crystal blue to charcoal grey in the span of minutes. Cordelia had ridden out alone, despite Bill Hawkins' warnings, following the same trail she and Pete had taken the day before. She needed to see her land again, needed to understand what was calling to her from those ancient trees. The first raindrops were cold and fat, striking her face with surprising force. Within moments, the gentle shower became a deluge, and the wind rose to a howl that bent the pines like grass. Her mare, spooked by a crack of thunder that seemed to split the very mountains, reared and bolted, leaving Cordelia sprawled in the muddy trail with her elegant riding habit torn and her dignity in tatters. The horse disappeared into the grey curtain of rain, taking with it her only sure way back to civilization. Cordelia struggled to her feet, water streaming from her hair and soaking through her silk blouse. In New York, she commanded armies of employees and controlled millions of dollars with the stroke of a pen. Here she was just another creature caught in nature's fury, as helpless as a sparrow in a hurricane. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, white flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. She stumbled forward, seeking any kind of shelter, her fine leather boots slipping on wet rocks and fallen leaves. The trail had become a stream, carrying away any hope of following it back to safety. Through the driving rain, she glimpsed a dark opening in the mountainside, a cave, perhaps, or at least an overhang that might offer protection from the storm's violence. She scrambled toward it, no longer caring about her appearance or the expensive clothes being ruined with each step. The cave proved deeper than she'd expected, extending back into the mountain far enough that the sound of rain became a distant whisper. She stood just inside the entrance, dripping and shivering, trying to wring water from her sodden skirts. The darkness was absolute beyond the grey light filtering in from outside, and she found herself wishing she'd thought to bring matches or a lantern. "You're trespassing." The voice came from the depths of the cave, low and gravelly, with an accent she couldn't place. Not quite southern, not quite western, but something older and wilder than either. Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered into the blackness, trying to make out the speaker. "I beg your pardon," she managed, drawing on decades of dealing with difficult men. "I was caught in the storm. I meant no harm." A shape detached itself from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of something that belonged in these mountains as naturally as the trees themselves. As her eyes adjusted, she began to make out details. Buckskin clothing that looked hand-sewn, dark hair shot with grey and worn longer than any civilized man would dare, and a face that might have been carved from the mountain stone itself. "This is my shelter," he said simply. "Has been for 15 years. Your shelter?" Cordelia straightened, calling upon the imperious manner that had cowed railroad barons and mining tycoons. "This is a natural cave on land that I own, according to legal deed filed with the territorial government." The man stepped closer, and she caught her first clear look at his eyes. They were the color of winter sky, pale blue-gray and utterly calm, studying her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare despite her sodden clothing. There was intelligence in those eyes, and something else, a depth of experience, that spoke of years lived close to elemental forces she'd never imagined. "Legal deeds don't mean much to the mountain," he said, "or to the things that live on it." Despite her predicament, Cordelia felt her business instinct stirring. This had to be Jeremiah Crow, the hermit the townspeople spoke of in whispers. Up close, he was not what she'd expected. Yes, he was primitive, dressed in skins and rough cloth, but there was something in his bearing that suggested education, refinement abandoned rather than never possessed. "You're Jeremiah Crow," He didn't confirm or deny, just continued studying her with those unsettling eyes. "You're the woman from back east, the one with more money than the territorial governor, Cordelia Whitmore." She extended her hand automatically, then felt foolish as he made no move to take it. "I know who you are." He moved to what she now saw was a small fire pit near the back of the cave, stirring coals to life with practiced efficiency. "Question is, what are you doing up here soaked to the bone and far from any trail?" The flames caught, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, and Cordelia saw that this was more than just a temporary shelter. There were signs of long habitation, neat stacks of firewood, cooking implements, even a few books on a natural stone shelf. This was a home, crude but comfortable, carved from the living rock. "I was exploring my property," she said, then added with less certainty, "I got caught in the storm." "Your property?" He spoke the words like they tasted bitter. "You own 3,000 acres of wilderness you've never seen before yesterday. Own it like you might own a chair or a carriage." The criticism stung, perhaps because it was accurate. "I purchased it legally. I have the deed." "Legal." He shook his head, adding wood to the fire. "White man's word for taking what was never theirs to give." He glanced at her, and she caught something that might have been amusement in those pale eyes. "Though I suppose a woman's no different when it comes to claiming dominion over wild places." "I haven't claimed dominion over anything. I merely own the land according to papers filed in offices by men who never walked these ridges or breathed this air." He stood, and she realized how tall he was, well over 6 feet, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of physical labor. "You want to dry those clothes before you catch your death?" The practical offer caught her off guard. For a moment, she'd forgotten her sodden state in the heat of their verbal sparring. Now, she became aware again of cold water dripping from her hair, of silk clinging uncomfortably to her skin. "Ah, yes, thank you." He turned his back with studied courtesy, busying himself with something at the far end of the cave. "There's a blanket there by the fire. Wool, but clean. You can hang your things on those rocks to dry." Cordelia hesitated. Everything in her refined upbringing rebelled against undressing in the presence of a strange man, even one who politely averted his eyes. But the chill was seeping into her bones, and practical necessity overruled social convention. She stripped quickly, wrapping the rough wool blanket around herself like a toga. The blanket smelled of wood smoke and something else. Clean mountain air, pine sap, the indefinable scent of a man who lived close to the natural world. It should have been unpleasant, but instead she found it oddly comforting. "Better?" he asked without turning around. "Much. Thank you." When he faced her again, something had changed in his expression. The watchful hostility had softened into something approaching concern, though his eyes still held that unsettling intensity. "Storm will blow over in an hour or so," he said. "I'll help you find your horse when it does. You don't have to. Can't leave a tenderfoot wandering around my mountain at night. Too many ways to die up here for someone who doesn't know the country." They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. The storm raged outside, but the cave felt safe, protected, removed from the ordinary world where she commanded shipping empires and railroad fortunes. "You have books," she observed, nodding toward the stone shelf. "Some." His voice suggested the subject was not open for discussion. "May I ask what you're reading?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then Emerson, Thoreau, Marcus Aurelius, books about men trying to understand their place in the natural order. The revelation surprised her. These were not the crude frontier novels she might have expected, but works of philosophy and literature that graced the libraries of educated men in Boston and New York. "You've had formal education." "Once, long time ago." He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave roof. "Seems like another man's life now." Before she could ask more, he stood and moved to the cave mouth, studying the grey wall of rain. "Letting up," he announced. "Be clear in another few minutes." As if responding to his words, the thunder began to move off. the intervals between lightning and sound growing longer, the rain gentled to a steady patter, then to intermittent drops. Cordelia rose to retrieve her clothes, now merely damp rather, even soaking. She dressed quickly behind the blanket, trying to restore some semblance of respectability to her appearance. When she turned back to thank her reluctant host, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Your horse'll be down by the creek," he said. "They always head for water when they're spooked." He was right. They found the mare cropping grass in a small meadow beside the stream, looking perfectly content despite her earlier panic. Jeremiah helped Cordelia mount. The first time his hands had touched her, she realized, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through her nervous system. "Thank you," she said, gathering the reins, "for the shelter and the rescue." He nodded without speaking, already turning to disappear back into his wilderness domain. But something made her call out to him. "Mr. Crow?" He paused, looking up at her with those winter sky eyes. "Will I see you again?" For a long moment, he studied her face as if reading something written there in a language she didn't know. When he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been in the cave, with an odd note of certainty that raised gooseflesh along her arms. "I can smell you're ready for sons." The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and intimate that she gasped. By the time she recovered enough to speak, he had vanished into the forest as silently as smoke, leaving her alone with a racing heart and a phrase that would echo in her mind for days to come. She rode back to Copper Creek in a daze, her practical mind trying to dismiss what had happened as the ravings of an eccentric hermit. But deep in her chest, something had awakened that she'd thought dead for decades, a hunger that had nothing to do with money or power or corporate conquest. That night, she lay in her hotel bed, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, her mother's, locket warm against her throat. Sons. At 58, with no husband and no prospects, the very idea was absurd. Yet her body remembered the feel of his hands helping her mount, remembered the scent of wood smoke and mountain air that clung to his rough blanket. And somewhere in the deepest part of her soul, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build a different kind of legacy entirely. 3 days passed before Cordelia could bring herself to return to the high country. 3 days of pacing her hotel room like a caged animal and trying to convince herself that her encounter with Jeremiah Crow had been nothing more than the romantic fancy of a lonely woman. She ordered the finest China tea service from Denver, telling herself she would civilize this wild place through sheer force of refinement. The porcelain cups arrived in a wooden crate, padded with straw, each piece wrapped in tissue paper like precious artifacts. Cordelia arranged them carefully on a silver tray, along with imported tea from Ceylon and small cakes from the hotel's limited kitchen. If she was going to visit a hermit in the wilderness, she would do so as a lady of breeding and culture. She found his cabin on her third attempt, following a barely visible trail that wound between massive pines and over granite outcroppings, worn smooth by centuries of weather. The structure was so cunningly built that she almost rode past it, logs fitted together without a single nail, the roof covered with living sod that made it seem like a natural part of the mountainside. Jeremiah was splitting wood in a small clearing, his axe rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a man who had performed this task thousands of times. He wore the same buckskin clothing she remembered, and his hair caught the afternoon light like strands of silver and copper woven together. Despite herself, Cordelia found her breath catching at the sight of him. He looked up as she approached, showing no surprise at her appearance. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Miss," she corrected automatically, then felt foolish for the distinction. "I brought tea." His eyes flicked to the elaborate service balanced on her saddle, and she caught what might have been the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Tea, yes. I thought we might talk properly." She dismounted with as much dignity as she could manage, lifting the silver tray from its precarious perch. About the land, about your presence here, my presence. You're squatting on property I own. In the civilized world, that would be cause for legal action. This time he did smile, an expression that transformed his weathered features entirely. Good thing we're not in the civilized world, then. He set down his axe and moved toward her with that fluid, predatory grace she remembered. Up close in daylight, she could see details that had been hidden in the cave's firelight. The network of small scars on his hands that spoke of a lifetime working with tools and weapons. The way his pale eyes seemed to catalogue everything around him with the alertness of a wild animal. "You didn't come here to evict me," he said simply. The statement hung between them, neither question nor accusation, but something more unsettling, a recognition that cut straight through her carefully prepared speech about property rights and legal obligations. "I came to understand," she said finally, "to understand what you meant. About sons." The word sent heat flooding through her cheeks, a reaction she hadn't experienced since girlhood. Among other things, he studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward a rough-hewn bench beside his cabin. "Set your china there. I'll get water for the kettle." The tea service looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of logs and wilderness, like a piece of another world that had somehow fallen through the sky. Cordelia arranged the cups with nervous precision, acutely aware of Jeremiah moving around his homestead with quiet efficiency. His cabin was small, but beautifully crafted, every log fitted so perfectly that no chinking was needed between them. A stone chimney rose from one end, sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the still air. Nearby stood a root cellar dug into the hillside, its entrance framed with carefully fitted stones. "You built all this yourself," she said when he returned. "With a battered metal kettle. Took 3 summers to get it right." He knelt beside a small fire ring, coaxing flames from carefully arranged kindling. "Had to learn which trees would season properly, how to cut them so they'd fit together without gaps." "Where did you learn such skills?" "Necessity. Trial and error. Books when I could find them." The fire caught, and he settled the kettle over. "The flames. Man can learn most anything if his life depends on it." They sat in surprising comfort as the water heated, surrounded by the vast silence of the mountains. Cordelia found herself studying his face in profile. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and snow. "Why did you come here?" she asked suddenly. "To this place, I mean. To this life." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. The kettle began to whistle, a thin, lonely sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. "Some men go to war and come home whole," he said finally, lifting the kettle from the flames. "Others come home in pieces, even if all their parts are still attached." The simple words carried such weight of pain that Cordelia felt something twist in her chest. The war between the states? Among other conflicts, he poured steaming water over the tea leaves, his movements careful and precise. "I spent 15 years learning to kill efficiently. Took another 15 to remember how to live." The tea, steeped in elegant china cups that had never been intended for wilderness consumption, the delicate porcelain incongruous against his calloused hands. But he handled the fragile service with surprising gentleness, as if he understood the care that had gone into its creation. "This is excellent tea," he said after his first sip. "Ceylon. The best money can buy." I'm sure it was expensive. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. "You disapprove of expense. I disapprove of waste." He gestured toward the wilderness surrounding them. "Everything here has a purpose, a place in the natural order. That cup you're holding, beautiful as it is, serves no function that a simple clay mug wouldn't serve better. Beauty is its own function, is it?" He leaned forward slightly, those pale eyes intent on her face. "Or is it just another wall between you and the world as it really is?" The question struck too close to truth for comfort. Cordelia set down her cup with unnecessary force, the delicate chime of porcelain against porcelain sharp in the mountain air. "You know nothing about my life, Mr. Crow. Nothing about the world I come from or the challenges I've faced. I know. You own more land than you've ever walked on, more houses than you can sleep in, more money than you can spend in 10 lifetimes. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the quiet words. "I know you came here because something's missing, something all that wealth can't buy. And what would that be?" He stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, his back turned to her as he gazed out over the valley below. When he spoke, his voice was softer, almost contemplative. Connection to something real, something that won't disappear when the market changes or the lawyers finish dividing up your estate. Despite her anger, Cordelia found herself following his gaze down into the green depths of her wilderness. From this height, she could see the stream winding between stands of aspen and pine, could trace the game trails that connected hidden meadows and secret places where no human foot had ever trod. "I've built something lasting," she said. But the word sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You've built monuments to your own cleverness. Impressive ones, I'll grant you, but monuments all the same." He turned back to face her, and she was surprised to see compassion rather than condemnation in his expression. "The question is what you want to build next." The afternoon sun slanted low through the trees, painting everything in golden light. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, and the sound seemed to echo off the very bones of the mountains. Cordelia sat surrounded by her fine china and expensive tea, feeling suddenly acutely aware of how artificial it all was. "I should go," she said, rising to pack away her civilized offerings. "It will be dark soon." He didn't argue, simply helped her load the tea service back onto her horse. But as she prepared to mount, he spoke again. "You're welcome here, Cordelia Whitmore, but next time, leave the fancy trappings behind. The mountain doesn't care about your money." As she rode away, his words echoing in her mind, Cordelia realized that for the first time in decades, she'd met someone who saw her not as a business opponent to be defeated or a wealthy patroness to be courted, but simply as a woman. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. She returned the next afternoon without the china, wearing her oldest traveling dress and carrying nothing but a simple canvas bag. Jeremiah was tending a small garden beside his cabin, coaxing late vegetables from the mountain soil with the same patient care he brought to everything else. "Better," he said, without looking up from the turnips he was harvesting. "Though you still look like you're dressed for church." Cordelia glanced down at her dark wool dress, which had seemed practical in her hotel room, but now appeared ridiculously formal against the backdrop of wilderness and honest labor. "I don't own anything more suitable. We'll remedy that." He straightened, brushing soil from his hands. But first, lesson 1. He led her to a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, its bark worn smooth by weather and time. From his pocket he produced a small wildflower, nothing more than a common mountain bloom with delicate purple petals and a stem no longer than her finger. "What do you see?" he asked, placing it in her palm. Cordelia examined the flower with the same attention she might give a business contract. A wildflower, purple petals, yellow center, probably grows in alpine meadows. What else? She looked more closely, turning the stem between her fingers. The leaves are serrated. The stem is hollow. "I'm afraid I don't know the species." "Forget the species." Jeremiah settled beside her on the log, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and pine sap in his hair. "What does it tell you?" "I don't understand." "This flower didn't choose where to grow. The seed fell where it fell, took root in whatever soil it found. But see how the stem bends toward the sun. How the roots," he gently lifted the tiny root system still clinging to the flower, "spread out to find what moisture they can in rocky ground." Cordelia nodded, beginning to sense some larger lesson in his words. "That's survival," he continued. "Not fighting the mountain, but learning to live with it. Finding your place in what already exists instead of trying to make everything bend to your will." The flower lay in her palm like a small revelation, its simple beauty suddenly profound, in a way that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. When had she last noticed something this small, this perfect in its unpretentious existence? Now, Jeremiah said, standing with that fluid grace she was beginning to recognize. Let's see if you can learn to move through the forest without announcing yourself to every creature within 5 miles. The next hour was humbling in ways Cordelia had never experienced. Every step she took seemed to produce a symphony of snapping twigs and rustling leaves. Her wool dress caught on every low branch, her leather boots slipped on wet rocks, and her corseted figure proved completely unsuited to ducking under fallen logs or climbing over stone outcroppings. "You're fighting the forest," Jeremiah observed after she'd stumbled for the 10th time. "Trying to force your way through instead of finding the path it offers. There is no path, there's always a path. You just have to learn to see it." He moved ahead of her with infuriating ease, his moccasined feet finding purchase on surfaces that sent her sliding, his lean frame slipping through spaces that seemed to close against her more civilized form. They stopped beside a small stream where water tumbled over granite boulders, worn smooth by centuries of flow. The sound was hypnotic, a liquid music that seemed to wash away the harsh edges of her frustration. "Watch," he said, and stepped into the current. The water swirled around his legs as he made his way across, but he moved with the flow rather than against it, reading the current's intentions and working with them. When he reached the other side, his buckskin leggings were barely dampened. "Your turn." Cordelia stared at the rushing water, acutely aware of her heavy skirts and impractical footwear. "I'll be soaked." "Probably." There was amusement in his voice, but also challenge. "Question is whether you'll let that stop you." She thought of all the boardroom battles she'd won, all the impossible negotiations she'd navigated through sheer force of will and superior preparation. Surely crossing a mountain stream couldn't be more difficult than outmaneuvering the Baltimore Railroad Commission. She was wrong. The water was shockingly cold, even through her boots, and the current stronger than it appeared. Her skirts immediately became waterlogged anchors, dragging at her legs and threatening to send her tumbling downstream. Halfway across, she slipped on a moss-covered rock and would have fallen if Jeremiah hadn't appeared beside her, his strong hands steadying her without seeming to exert any effort. "Easy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the waters. "Rush. Feel where the current wants to take you, then use that energy instead of fighting it." His hands remained on her waist as she found her footing, and she became suddenly intensely aware of his touch. The warmth of his palms through the wet wool, the careful strength of his grip, the way his body seemed to radiate heat in the cold mountain air. When had a man's hands last touched her? When had she allowed such intimacy, even for practical purposes? "Better," he said, as she took another careful step. "Now you're listening to the water instead of shouting at it." They made it across together, Cordelia's dress thoroughly soaked, but her dignity somewhat intact. On the far bank she stood dripping and shivering, while Jeremiah built a small fire with the same efficient movements she'd witnessed before. "Sit," he commanded, and she found herself obeying without argument. The flames caught quickly, sending welcome warmth across her sodden form. "In New York," she said when she could speak without chattering teeth, "crossing a stream means finding a bridge or hiring a carriage to take you around. And if there's no bridge, no carriage, then you don't cross." He looked at her with those pale, penetrating eyes. "Must be a lot of places you've never been then." The observation stung because it was true. For all her wealth and power, her world was surprisingly small, a series of connected islands of civilization surrounded by vast territories she'd never explored. She owned 3,000 acres of wilderness, but until this week she'd never walked more than a few yards from a well-maintained trail. "Tell me about your life," she said suddenly, "before this place, before the war." His face closed down, that brief openness replaced by the careful neutrality she'd noticed before. "Nothing much to tell." "I don't believe that." She leaned forward, studying his profile in the firelight. "You speak like an educated man. You read philosophy. You have skills that take years to master. Men don't acquire such things by accident." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly she had to strain to hear over the fire's crackling, he began to speak. "My father was a minister, Presbyterian. He believed in education, in bettering oneself through study and contemplation." Jeremiah poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "I went to college back in Pennsylvania, read Latin and Greek, studied theology and natural philosophy." "What changed?" "The war. Fort Sumter, then Bull Run. Every young man with any sense of honor was signing up, and I was no different." His voice took on a bitter edge. "Thought I understood something about duty, about serving God and country. And you learned differently?" "I learned that there's a difference between reading about courage in books and watching boys die screaming in muddy fields. I learned that orders from men in clean uniforms can turn decent soldiers into killers of innocent folk." He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I learned that some things, once done, can never be undone." The pain in his voice was so raw that Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand, where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and calloused, scarred by years of hard work and harder choices. "You came here to heal," she said softly. "I came here to hide." He didn't pull away from her touch, but neither did he turn his hand to clasp hers. 15 years, and I'm still not sure there's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned down to glowing coals and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the sound seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks like a voice from another world. "I should take you back," Jeremiah said finally. "These mountains aren't safe for a tenderfoot after dark." But neither of them moved to leave. The firelight painted golden highlights in his hair and cast dancing shadows across his weathered features. Cordelia found herself memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes reflected the flames like chips of winter sky. "Jeremiah," she said, testing his name on her tongue. "It's a beautiful name, biblical. Means God will uplift. My father's choice." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Not sure the good Lord has much uplifting planned for me. Perhaps he's been uplifting you all along, and you simply haven't recognized it." She gestured toward the cabin, the garden, the carefully tended clearing that spoke of years of patient labor. "This place, what you've built here, it's not hiding. It's creating something beautiful from nothing." He looked at her then, with an expression she couldn't read, something that might have been surprise or gratitude or recognition. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Finally, he rose and kicked dirt over the fire's remains. "Come on, city woman. Time to get you back to your feather bed and hot baths." As they walked through the darkness toward where her horse waited, Cordelia found herself reluctant to leave this place, where time seemed to move differently, where conversation could touch on subjects her sophisticated New York social circle never dared explore. The wildflower was still pressed in her palm, its delicate petals already beginning to dry, but somehow more precious than any of the expensive jewelry waiting in her hotel room. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return again, and perhaps tomorrow. She would ask him about the suns he claimed to smell on her, a conversation that both terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, its yellow paper crackling with urgent authority as Bill Hawkins knocked on her hotel room door. Cordelia had been preparing for another day in the mountains, had even commissioned the local seamstress to alter one of her simpler dresses for more practical wear. The sight of Western Union's familiar format made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Urgent stop. Baltimore Railroad, merger failing. Stop your immediate return. Required. Stop fortune at stake. "Stop, Lawson," she read it 3 times before the words fully registered. The Baltimore deal, 6 months of careful negotiation that would cement her control over East Coast shipping routes. Without it, her empire would remain vulnerable to competitors who were already circling like vultures, sensing weakness in her prolonged absence. "Bad news?" Hawkins asked, noting her expression. "Business." She folded the telegram carefully, as if proper handling might somehow change its contents. "I may need to return to New York immediately." But even as she spoke the words, something in her chest rebelled against them. The thought of leaving these mountains, of abandoning whatever was growing between her and Jeremiah Crow, felt like a betrayal of something precious and fragile. She found him that afternoon chopping firewood, with the methodical rhythm she'd come to associate with all his work. The sound of his axe carried across the clearing like a heartbeat, steady and sure. He looked up as she approached, and something in her face must have warned him of trouble. "You're leaving," he said simply. It wasn't a question, and the certainty in his voice made her throat tighten. "There's a crisis in my business affairs, a deal that could collapse if I'm not there to salvage it. And that matters to you. It should matter to me. It's what I've spent 35 years building." She dismounted and moved to where he stood, the axe balanced easily in his hands. Millions of dollars, thousands of jobs, an entire network of enterprises that depend on my decisions. But the single word hung between them, loaded with understanding. She looked around the clearing, at his cabin with its living roof, at the garden where late vegetables still clung to life despite the approaching winter, at the man himself standing patient and still in the afternoon light. "But I don't want to go," she whispered, the admission torn from some deep place she'd kept locked for decades. He set down the axe and moved toward her with that fluid grace that never failed to steal her breath. When he reached her, he didn't touch her, but his presence was warm and solid and utterly reassuring. "What would happen if you didn't return?" "I'd lose the merger, probably lose controlling interest in 3 shipping companies and the Pittsburgh rail line." The words came automatically, the language of commerce and conquest that had been her native tongue for so long. "Other men would divide up what I've built. Within a year, the Whitmore name would mean nothing in business circles. And that frightens you." "It should frighten me. It's everything I am, everything I've worked for." She looked up at him, searching his face for something she couldn't name. "But standing here, telling you about it, it feels like describing someone else's life." He was quiet for a long moment, those pale eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "What do you want, Cordelia? Not what you should want, not what duty demands, but what you actually want." The question hit her like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked her what she wanted? Her entire adult life had been structured around obligation, first to her father's memory, then to the businesses that bore her name, finally to the abstract concept of legacy that had driven her relentless accumulation of wealth and power. "I want," she began, then stopped, the words catching in her throat. "I want to stay here. I want to learn the things you could teach me. I want to understand why a pressed wildflower feels more precious than all the jewelry in my safe." And the single syllable carried such weight of invitation that she felt tears spring to her eyes. He knew somehow what she was afraid to voice even to herself. "I want to know what you meant about sons," she whispered. "I want to know if it's too late for a woman like me to build something that lives and breathes instead of just counting. Profits." His hands came up then to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. The touch was so gentle, so reverent, that it broke something loose in her chest that had been frozen for 35 years. "It's not too late," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her believe it might actually be true. "But the choice has to be yours, freely made. I won't be responsible for destroying what you've spent your life building." "What if I want it destroyed?" The words surprised her with their vehemence. "What if I'm tired of being empress of an empire that feels like a beautiful prison?" "Then you'll find the strength to walk away from it. His hands remained on her face, anchoring her to this moment, to this choice that felt more momentous than any business decision she'd ever made. But not because of me, because of who you are underneath all that wealth and power. They stood like that as the afternoon light slanted long through the pines, two people balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Cordelia felt the weight of her entire life pressing down on her, the expectations, the responsibilities, the careful structure of success that had defined her for so long. And then, like a wildflower finding its way through a crack in stone, she felt something else, the stirring of a woman who had been buried so long under layers of ambition and duty that she'd almost forgotten she existed. "Will you help me send a reply to New York?" she asked finally. "Of course, I'll need to use words they'll understand, language that makes it clear this isn't a temporary absence or a moment of feminine weakness." He smiled then, the expression transforming his weathered features entirely. "I have a feeling you'll find the right words." That evening, by lamplight in the hotel's cramped office, she composed her response with the same careful precision she'd once brought to hostile takeovers and complex negotiations. "Baltimore merger, proceeding without my involvement. Stop recommend, selling railroad interests to highest bidder. Stop effective immediately reducing active business participation. Stop will. Review quarterly reports." But no longer available for daily operations. "Stop Whitmore." She read it 3 times before handing it to the telegraph operator, each word a small revolution, a quiet declaration of independence from the life that had once seemed inevitable. "You sure about this, miss?" the operator asked, recognizing the magnitude of what he was being asked to transmit. "I'm sure," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it completely. Walking back to her room through the mountain darkness, she felt lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow she would return to Jeremiah's clearing, not as the visiting empress of a shipping dynasty, but as a woman learning to live by different rhythms, different values, different dreams. The pressed wildflower waited on her nightstand, its simple beauty a promise of things to come. When she arrived at his cabin the next morning, Cordelia found a bundle waiting on the bench where they'd shared tea just days before. The buckskin dress was beautiful in its simplicity, soft leather the color of autumn leaves, decorated with delicate beadwork that caught the morning light like scattered stars. "I started this the day after you first visited," Jeremiah said, emerging from his workshop with wood shavings caught in his hair. "Figured you'd need proper clothes if you were serious about staying." She held the dress up against herself, marveling at how perfectly he'd judged her measurements without ever touching more than her hand. The leather was supple and warm, worked to an incredible softness that spoke of hours of patient labor. "It's beautiful," she breathed, "but I couldn't accept something so—" "Try it on," he interrupted gently. "See how it feels to move without fighting your clothes every step." The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the woman who'd struggled through underbrush and stumbled over fallen logs. The buckskin moved with her body like a second skin, allowing her to bend and reach and climb in ways her corseted dresses had never permitted. For the first time since childhood, she felt the simple joy of physical freedom. "Better," Jeremiah observed with satisfaction. "Now you look like someone who belongs in these mountains." The compliment warmed her in ways she hadn't expected. When had anyone's approval mattered so much? When had she cared more about fitting into a place than dominating it? That afternoon, he began teaching her the skills she'd need to survive in his world. How to read the sky for weather signs, how to find edible plants and clean water, how to move through the forest without leaving an obvious trail. Each lesson was a revelation, opening her eyes to a complexity in the natural world she'd never suspected. "Everything's connected," he explained, as they knelt beside a small stream, studying the insects that danced above its surface. Those midges feed the trout feed the bears fertilize the soil that grows the berries that feed the birds, that spread the seeds that become the trees. Nothing exists alone, and we fit into that somehow, if we're wise. We do. Take only what we need, give back more than we consume, recognize that we're part of something larger than ourselves. He glanced at her, and she caught something that might have been amusement in his eyes. Different from the business world, where the goal is to consume as much as possible and give back as little as the law requires. The observation stung because it was accurate. Her entire business philosophy had been built on the principle of maximum extraction, squeezing every possible cent of profit from every venture, regardless of the human or environmental cost. "I was never cruel," she said defensively. "I paid. Fair wages, maintained safe working conditions. Fair by whose standards? Safe compared to what?" His voice remained gentle, but there was challenge beneath the quiet words. "Did you ever ask your workers what they needed to truly thrive, or just what they needed to keep them productive?" She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it as memories surfaced unbidden. The families evicted when she'd bought tenement buildings and raised rents to market rates. The small competitors driven out of business by her superior resources and ruthless efficiency. The way she'd celebrated each victory without considering the human cost of her success. "I did what was necessary to survive in that world," she said finally. "And now you're learning to survive in this one." He stood, brushing dirt from his buckskin leggings. "The question is, which kind of survival feels more like living?" As the days passed, Cordelia found herself settling into rhythms she'd never imagined possible. She woke with the sun, slept when darkness fell, measured time by the turning of seasons rather than the opening and closing of markets. Her hands grew rough from honest work, her body strong from physical labor, her mind clear. In ways it hadn't been since childhood, but more than physical changes were taking place. In quiet moments beside his fire or walking the mountain trails, she found herself opening to Jeremiah in ways that terrified and exhilarated her. They talked of everything: her lonely childhood in her father's house, his struggles with faith. After the war, their shared sense of being displaced persons in a world that seemed to have no real place for them. "I used to think strength meant never showing weakness," she confessed one evening as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Never letting anyone see that you hurt or needed anything. Loneliest way to live imaginable," he replied softly. "Real strength is knowing when to let someone help carry the load." "Is that what you're doing, helping carry my load?" He turned to look at her then, his face serious in the firelight. "I'm learning to let you help carry mine." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. But that night, for the first time since her arrival, Cordelia didn't return to her hotel room. Instead, she slept on a simple pallet near his fire, wrapped in wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and mountain air. She woke to find him gone, but coffee was warm on the coals and a note waited beside her bedroll. "Gone hunting. Back by sunset. There's bread and honey in the cabin." The casual domesticity of it made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When had anyone cared for her comfort without expectation of payment or favor in return? When had she been trusted with someone's home, their private sanctuary? She spent the day exploring his world with new eyes, seeing details that had escaped her notice before. The way he'd positioned his cabin to catch the morning sun, but remain shaded in the heat of afternoon. The careful placement of his garden where it would receive optimal light and drainage. The network of trails he'd carved through the surrounding forest, each one serving a specific purpose: wood gathering, hunting, access to different water sources. Everything spoke of years of patient observation, of learning to work with the land rather than imposing his will upon it. It was a different kind of mastery than she'd known, one built on humility and respect rather than dominance and control. When he returned at sunset with 2 fat rabbits, she had dinner waiting, simple, fare of bread and preserved vegetables, but prepared with a care that transformed the humble meal into something approaching ceremony. "You've been thinking," he observed, noting something in her expression. "About legacy," she admitted, "about what it means to build something lasting. And what have you concluded?" She looked around the cabin, at the books on their rough shelf, at the tools made smooth by years of use, at the man himself who'd created this sanctuary from nothing but skill and determination. "That maybe the most lasting things can't be bought or sold," she said quietly. "Maybe they have to be lived." He smiled then, the expression warm and approving, and Cordelia felt something shift in her chest, a wall crumbling, a door opening, the first stirring of something that felt dangerously close to home. The photograph fell from between the pages of Marcus Aurelius like a leaf from an autumn tree, landing face up on the rough wooden floor of Jeremiah's cabin. Cordelia had been returning the book to its place on the shelf when the faded daguerreotype slipped free, and now she stared down at an image that made no sense in the context of everything she thought she knew. The man in the photograph wore a Union Army colonel's uniform, his brass buttons gleaming despite the image's age. The face was younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakably Jeremiah's. The same pale eyes, the same strong jaw, the same bearing that spoke of natural authority. Behind him stood a group of officers, their faces serious with the weight of command. "You weren't supposed to see that." His voice from the cabin's doorway made her jump. She'd been so absorbed in the photograph that she hadn't heard him return from checking his rabbit snares. Now he stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain. "Colonel Jeremiah." "Crow," she read from the notation on the photograph's back. "Commanding Officer, 14th Pennsylvania Volunteers." She looked up at him, her mind struggling to reconcile this evidence with the primitive mountain man she'd come to know. "You were an officer, for a time." He entered the cabin and closed the door behind him, his movements careful and controlled. "Before I remembered that some things matter more than rank and military glory, but this changes everything." She held up the photograph, her business mind racing through implications. "You're not just some uneducated hermit who chose the wilderness. Over civilization. You had position, education, prospects, and I gave them all up." His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before, something that might have been warning. "Just like you're doing now." The parallel hit her like cold water. "It's not the same thing at all. I'm choosing love over duty, choosing a real life over an empty existence, and you think I chose differently." He moved to the fireplace, his back turned to her as he stirred the coals to life. "You think I came here because I was weak, because I couldn't handle the responsibilities of civilized life? I didn't mean—" She stopped, recognizing the dangerous ground she was treading. "Tell me what happened. Help me understand." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of flames catching kindling and the distant call of a hawk somewhere in the mountains above. "I was a good soldier," he said finally, "maybe too good. Won commendations for bravery, citations for tactical brilliance, the respect of men who'd seen hell and lived to tell about it." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he were reciting someone else's history. "I led charges that broke Confederate lines, planned maneuvers that saved Union lives, earned promotion after promotion until I commanded a full regiment." Cordelia settled into the chair by his table, sensing that whatever was coming would require her full attention. The war was ending. Everyone could feel it. Lee was running out of men and supplies. Sherman had cut the Confederacy in half. Grant was squeezing Richmond like a vice. Jeremiah added another piece of wood to the fire, his movements precise and economical. But there were still pockets of resistance, still men willing to die for a cause they knew was lost. And you were ordered to deal with them. There was a plantation in Virginia. Beautiful place, or had been once. Grand house with white columns, gardens that must have been magnificent before the war tore everything apart. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing it all again. Intelligence said it was being used as a Confederate supply depot, that weapons and ammunition were being stored there for guerrilla operations against our supply lines. Cordelia felt her stomach tighten, sensing tragedy in the careful precision of his words. My orders were simple: take the plantation, capture any military supplies, arrest any Confederate personnel. He turned from the fire to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. What we found was different. What did you find? Children, old people, women whose husbands and sons had died in the war. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as if he were trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. The supply depot was just a handful of rusty muskets and some moldy ammunition that wouldn't have been useful to anyone. But my orders were clear, and I'd never questioned orders before. You followed them. I followed them. The words came out like a confession, heavy with self-loathing. I arrested everyone in that house, 12 people, none of them soldiers, none of them threats to anyone. I burned the supplies, burned the house, burned everything that might have been of use to Confederate forces. Cordelia waited, knowing there was more, dreading what she was about to hear. 2 days later, word came down from headquarters. There had been a mistake in the intelligence reports. The real supply depot was 20 miles south. The plantation I'd destroyed. It had been sheltering refugee families, people who'd lost everything else in the war and had nowhere else to go. Oh, Jeremiah. The children died first. Exposure, mostly, though one little girl had consumption. The old people lasted a few weeks longer in the refugee camp where they'd been relocated. The women, his voice broke slightly. The women survived, but I used to get letters from their relatives. Detailed descriptions of how my efficiency in following orders had destroyed the last remnant of their families. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant whisper of wind through pine branches. Cordelia sat perfectly still, understanding now why he'd chosen exile, why a man with every advantage civilization could offer had fled to these empty mountains. How long ago? She asked quietly. 18 years. I resigned my commission the day after the war ended, turned in my uniform, and walked away from everything I'd been. He looked at the photograph still clutched in her hands. Took me 3 years to find this place, another 5 to build something that felt like home instead of just hiding, and the other 10 years, learning to live with what I'd done, learning that some mistakes are too big to fix, too permanent to undo. He moved to stand beside her chair, his presence warm and solid, despite the pain in his voice. Learning that sometimes the best you can do is make sure you never cause that kind of harm again. Cordelia set the photograph on the table with careful reverence, understanding now that she was holding the last remnant of a life deliberately abandoned. You could have stayed, built a new career, used your experience and education to help rebuild the country. With what? The same judgment that led me to burn out refugee families. The same blind obedience to authority that let me destroy innocence. Because someone with more rank than sense gave me orders. He shook his head. Some men are broken by war in ways that show, missing limbs, visible scars, shell shock that everyone can see. Others are broken in quieter ways. You're not broken. The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. What you've built here, what you've learned, the man you've become, that's not the work of someone broken beyond repair, isn't it? His smile was sad but genuine. A decorated colonel who lives alone in the wilderness, who hasn't worn civilized clothes or slept under a proper roof in 15 years? Who's so afraid of causing harm that he avoids all human contact except with a lonely businesswoman who wandered into his forest? The description stung because it was accurate, but it was also incomplete. You saved me, she said simply, from the storm, from my own emptiness, from a life that had everything except meaning. If that's what broken looks like, then maybe being broken isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person. He knelt beside her chair then, his hands covering hers where they rested on the photograph. I need you to understand something, Cordelia. I didn't choose this life because I was noble or wise or particularly strong. I chose it because I was a coward who couldn't face the consequences of his actions. And I need you to understand something, she replied, turning her hands to clasp his. I don't care why you came here. I only care who you are now, in this moment, in this place we've found together. The photograph lay between them, a testament to choices made and prices paid. But looking into Jeremiah's eyes, those same pale eyes that had commanded troops and witnessed horrors and somehow found their way to gentleness, Cordelia knew that the past, however painful, had led them both to this moment. What do we do now? She whispered. We decide if two broken people can make something whole together, he answered. We decide if love is strong enough to build on ruins. Outside, the mountain wind sighed through the pines like a benediction, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called out across the vast wilderness that had become their sanctuary. The ring was so simple, it might have been overlooked by someone seeking ostentation. Just a band of gold hammered smooth by patient hands, with no adornment save the love that had shaped it. Jeremiah had fashioned it himself in the forge he'd built behind his cabin, working the metal with the same careful attention he brought to everything else in his ordered life. "Will you marry me, Cordelia Whitmore?" he asked, offering the ring on his open palm as they sat beside the stream where she'd first learned to cross running water without fighting the current. The words hung in the mountain air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and full of possibility. Cordelia stared at the simple gold band, thinking of all the elaborate jewelry she'd owned over the years, diamond bracelets from Tiffany, emerald necklaces from European craftsmen, pearls from the South Pacific that had cost more than most. People earned in a lifetime. None of them had ever meant a fraction of what this rough-hewn circle represented. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with all the certainty her heart could hold. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and she was amazed by how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting her entire life to find its place. The gold was warm against her skin, warm with the heat of his forge and his labor and his love. They were planning a simple ceremony in the clearing beside his cabin, with Bill Hawkins to perform the service. He'd been ordained years ago and still kept his ministerial credentials current for occasions like births and deaths and the rare mountain wedding. A few of the townspeople had agreed to serve as witnesses, though Cordelia suspected their attendance had more to do with curiosity than affection. "Strangest courtship I ever heard of," Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had confided to anyone who would listen. "Rich Eastern lady and a hermit mountain man. Mark my words, she'll be back in New York before the snows melt, wondering what came over her." But the speculation and gossip felt distant, unimportant, compared to the quiet joy of planning a life. With Jeremiah, they spoke of practical things: how to winterize the cabin for two people, where to expand the garden, whether they should add a room for the children they both hoped would come. The conversations were tender and tentative, two people learning to weave their separate lives into something shared and strong. Then, on a crisp morning exactly 1 week before their planned wedding, 3 men in expensive suits arrived on the stage from Denver, carrying leather portfolios and grim expressions that Cordelia recognized all too well. "Miss Whitmore," the eldest of them said, tipping his hat with practiced courtesy. "I'm James Lawson, senior partner at Lawson, Mitchell and Associates. We represent your business interests." She knew Lawson by reputation, a lawyer who specialized in complex corporate litigation, the sort of man who could unravel a business empire with surgical precision if the price was right. His presence in Copper Creek could mean only one thing. The vultures had finally decided to pick clean the bones of her abandoned fortune. "Gentlemen," she said carefully, acutely aware that she was wearing her buckskin dress and probably smelled of wood smoke and mountain air, "this is unexpected. I'm afraid we have urgent matters to discuss, privately if possible." They took rooms at the hotel and commandeered the small dining room for their meeting, spreading contracts and financial statements across tables meant for simple meals. The papers told a story Cordelia had been expecting, but had somehow managed to avoid thinking about Without her direct oversight, her business empire was collapsing with remarkable speed. The Baltimore merger fell through entirely, Lawson explained, his tone carefully neutral. When word spread that you were no longer actively managing operations, investors began pulling out of other ventures as well. The Pittsburgh rail line has been sold to cover debts. 3 of the shipping companies have filed for reorganization, and the bank consortium is demanding immediate repayment of loans secured by properties that are now worth less than half their original value. The numbers swam before her eyes. Millions lost, thousands of jobs eliminated, an empire built over decades crumbling in a matter of weeks. Any one of these disasters would have sent her racing back to New York just months ago. Now she felt oddly detached, as if they were discussing someone else's misfortune. "What are my remaining assets worth?" she asked. "If we act quickly, we can salvage perhaps 20% of your holdings, enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, though nothing approaching your former wealth." Lawson leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But time is critical. Every day you remain absent costs. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost opportunities and mounting penalties. 20%. Even that fraction would still make her wealthier than most people could imagine, but it represented the destruction of everything she'd built since her father's death. She should have been devastated, furious, desperate to salvage. What remained? Instead, she found herself thinking of Jeremiah working in his garden, of the simple ring on her finger, of mornings spent learning to read weather signs and evenings discussing philosophy by firelight. "There's another matter," the second lawyer said, consulting his notes. "Your prolonged absence has raised questions about your mental competence. Several board members are prepared to petition the court for a conservatorship, claiming that no rational person would abandon such substantial holdings without cause. They're claiming I'm insane. They're claiming you've suffered some form of breakdown that renders you incapable of managing your own affairs." Lawson's voice remained professionally neutral, but she caught a hint of distaste in his expression. The mountain hermit, the primitive living conditions, the abandonment of all social and business responsibilities, it makes for a compelling narrative of mental instability. The casual dismissal of her choices, the implication that love and contentment were evidence of madness, sparked the first real anger she'd felt since the lawyers arrived. "And what would you recommend?" "Return to New York immediately. Resume active management of your affairs. Show the business community that you're still the formidable Cordelia Whitmore they've always known." He paused, then added with careful delicacy, "As for your personal arrangements here, discretion would be advisable. A brief mountain holiday, perhaps, taken to recover from business pressures." "You want me to deny that I'm marrying Jeremiah? I want to protect your reputation and your remaining assets. A rushed marriage to an unknown mountain man would only fuel speculation about your mental state." The 3 lawyers sat waiting for her response, their faces betraying nothing of their personal opinions about her situation. They were professionals doing their job, protecting the interests of a client whose behavior had become inexplicably erratic by their standards. Cordelia looked down at the simple gold ring on her finger, then out the window toward the mountains. Where Jeremiah waited, the choice before her was starker than any business decision she'd ever faced. Return to New York and salvage what remained of her empire, or stay and lose everything except the man she'd learned to love. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Time we don't have," Lawson replied. "The conservatorship hearing is scheduled for next month. If you're not present to defend your competency—" "I said I need time." The steel in her voice was something they all recognized, an echo of the woman who had dominated boardrooms and bent railroad barons to her will. "You'll have my answer tomorrow." That evening, she found Jeremiah at his favorite spot overlooking the valley, watching the last light fade from the western peaks. He didn't turn when she approached, but she saw tension in the set of his shoulders that told her he knew something was wrong. "They want you to go back," he said simply. "How did you—" 3 lawyers don't travel this far into the wilderness for a social call." He stood and faced her, his expression carefully neutral. "The question is what you want to do about it." She told him everything: the financial collapse, the conservatorship threat, the impossible choice between love and the remnants of her former life. He listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. 20% of your fortune would still be more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes, he said when she finished. We could live very comfortably on a fraction of what they're saying you could salvage. That's not the point, isn't it? His pale eyes searched her face. Or is the real issue that you're not sure you can walk away from being Cordelia Whitmore, Empress of Commerce, and settle for being just Cordelia Crow, mountain wife? The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Part of her was terrified by the prospect of losing not just her wealth, but her identity, the sense of purpose and power that had defined her for so long. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love this life we're building together. I love who I am when I'm with you. But 35 years of my life are crumbling while I sit in paradise pretending the outside world doesn't exist." Tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I built something, Jeremiah. It may not have been as beautiful or meaningful as what we have here, but it was mine. It employed thousands of people, moved goods and materials that helped build this country. Does that count for nothing?" He pulled her into his arms then, holding her against his chest, while she wept for the loss of things she'd thought she no longer valued. His heart beat steady and strong beneath her cheek, an anchor in the storm of her confusion. "It counts for everything," he said softly. "The question is whether it counts for more than what you found here." "I don't know," she whispered. "God help me, I don't know." They stood together as full darkness settled over the mountains. Two people balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow she would have to choose between the life she'd built and the life she'd discovered, between the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. The simple gold ring on her finger caught starlight like a promise, but even promises, she was learning, sometimes required impossible choices. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on every surface, and the air so crisp it seemed to ring like crystal when she breathed. Cordelia stood on the small balcony outside her hotel room, watching the sun paint the eastern peaks in shades of gold and rose, and felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in days. The lawyers were gone. Their urgent papers and desperate deadlines returned to Denver on yesterday's stage. She had given them her answer in words that left no room for misinterpretation. "I choose love over empire. I choose life over legacy. I choose Jeremiah Crow over everything else the world has to offer." Lawson had shaken his head with something that might have been admiration or pity. "You realize this means the end of everything you've built?" "No," she'd replied, surprised by her own certainty. "It means the beginning of everything that matters." Now, as she prepared for the simple ceremony that would make her Mrs. Jeremiah Crow, she felt no regret for the millions she was losing or the empire she was abandoning. The buckskin dress Jeremiah had made for her hung ready, its soft leather warm with morning sunlight. She had no veil, no elaborate gown, no army of servants to help her prepare. Instead, she had Mrs. Henderson with her kind hands braiding wildflowers into her hair, and her own heart singing with a joy she'd never known was possible. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Different than when you first arrived, but beautiful in a way that suits." "You better." Cordelia studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman, looking back, bore little resemblance to the sharp-featured business empress who had stepped off the train weeks ago. The mountain sun had warmed her pale complexion, honest work had softened her angular features, and something deeper, contentment, perhaps, or simple happiness, had gentled the calculating hardness around her eyes. "I feel beautiful," she said, and meant it completely. The ceremony was held in the clearing beside Jeremiah's cabin, with benches made from split logs and an arch of evergreen branches decorated with late-blooming wildflowers. Perhaps 20 people had come, most of Copper Creek's small population, along with a few mountain folk who rarely ventured into town but had heard about the unusual wedding and come out of curiosity. Jeremiah stood waiting beneath the arch, dressed in clean buckskins, with his long hair tied back with a leather cord. He'd trimmed his beard and polished his boots, small concessions to ceremony that touched her heart with their thoughtfulness. When he saw her approaching, his face lit with a smile that made her forget every doubt she'd ever harbored about her choice. Bill Hawkins performed the service with dignity and warmth, speaking of love that transcends worldly considerations and partnerships built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But Cordelia barely heard the familiar words, lost as she was in Jeremiah's eyes and the incredible reality of what was happening. Do you, Jeremiah Crow, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled witnesses. I take her as she is, where she is, with all her strength and all her fears, to build something together that neither of us could create alone. The words weren't part of the traditional ceremony, but they were perfect in their honesty and depth. When Bill turned to her with the same question, she felt her own response rising from someplace deeper than thought or preparation. I do, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. I take him as he is, where he is, with all his wisdom and all his wounds, to learn from him and to love him and to create a legacy measured in joy rather than gold. They exchanged rings, his simple gold band joining her own, and when Bill pronounced them husband and wife, Jeremiah kissed her with a tenderness that made the small gathering sigh with vicarious happiness. The kiss tasted of mountain air and promises kept, of futures freely chosen and love courageously claimed. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt. Mrs. Henderson had baked a wedding cake, someone had brought out a fiddle, and even the most hardened mountain men found themselves smiling at the obvious happiness of the unlikely couple. Cordelia danced with her new husband in the firelight, her buckskin dress swirling around her legs and her hair coming loose from its braided crown. As the evening wore on and their guests began to drift away, she found herself standing beside the cabin she would now call home, looking up at stars so brilliant they seemed within reach. Jeremiah came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on the top of her head. Any regrets? He asked softly. She leaned back against his strength, feeling the simple gold ring solid on her finger and the even more solid reality of his love surrounding her. In New York, lawyers were probably dividing up her empire. Her former associates were probably shaking their heads at her folly, and newspapers were probably describing her dramatic fall from financial grace. None of it mattered. She had found something worth more than all the gold in the world, a man who loved her, not for what she owned, but for who she was, and a place where she could build a different kind of legacy entirely. Not one, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The telegram arrived 3 days after their wedding, carried by a breathless rider who'd pushed hard to reach them with news that couldn't wait for the regular stage. Cordelia read it twice before the words fully registered, her hands trembling slightly as she held the yellow paper. Whitmore. Enterprises declared bankruptcy. Stop all assets seized. Stop creditors demanding immediate settlement. Stop fortune entirely. Lost stop. Conservatorship. Petition withdrawn. Stop. Nothing left to conserve. Stop. Deepest regrets. Stop. Lawson, she should have been devastated. 35 years of careful building, of strategic thinking and calculated risks, wiped out in a few. Weeks of benign neglect. Every ship, every railway car, every piece of property bearing the Whitmore name was gone, sold to satisfy creditors and pay the debts that accumulated when an empire collapsed. Instead, She felt something unexpected. Relief. "Bad news?" Jeremiah asked. Looking up from the cradle he was carving from a single piece of pine, a wedding gift to themselves and a statement of faith in the future they were building together. "The best possible news," she said, and surprised herself by laughing. "I'm officially penniless, completely, utterly, magnificently broke." He set down his carving tools and studied her face, looking for signs of the shock or grief he'd expected. Instead, he saw something that might have been liberation. "You're certain this is good news? I'm free, Jeremiah. For the first time since my father died, I'm completely free." She moved to where he sat and settled beside him on the cabin's front. Step, the telegram fluttering forgotten in the mountain breeze. No more board meetings to attend, no more crises to manage, no more decisions that affect thousands of people I've never met. No more gilded cage. The morning sun slanted through the pines, warming their faces and painting everything in shades of gold and green. Somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgled over stones, and birds called from invisible perches. It was, Cordelia realized, exactly what happiness sounded like. What about the conservatorship? Hard to declare, someone mentally incompetent for mismanaging money they no longer possess. She leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how solid and reassuring his presence felt. "I suppose they'll find other wealthy women to torment with their legal maneuvering." Jeremiah's arm came around her, holding her close as they watched the morning light chase shadows across their small domain. The clearing looked different now that it was officially theirs, not because of legal deeds or property rights, but because they'd chosen it together as the place to build their life. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, her heart racing with nervousness and anticipation. "Something good? Something miraculous." She turned to face him fully, studying the weathered features that had become more precious to her than any treasure. "When you said you could smell I was ready for sons, I thought you were speaking metaphorically, about my readiness to nurture something other than a business empire." His pale eyes sharpened with attention, and she saw hope flickering in their depths. "But you meant it literally, didn't you?" Her hand moved to rest on her still flat belly, where the tiniest spark of new life was beginning to grow. "You could actually sense what my own body hadn't yet told me." The silence stretched between them, filled with such joy and wonder that it seemed to encompass all the mountains around them. Then Jeremiah's hand covered hers, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be. All the signs are there, though it's early yet." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were tears of pure happiness. "At 58, when I thought such dreams were impossible, when I'd given up hope of ever creating anything more lasting than corporate contracts," he kissed her then, cutting off her words, with lips that tasted of wonder and gratitude and fierce, protective love. When they broke apart, both were crying, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. "A son," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "or a daughter, or perhaps both eventually." She laughed at his startled expression. "I may be starting late, but I've always been thorough in my endeavors." They sat in perfect contentment. As the sun climbed higher and the mountain air warmed around them, the cradle beside them, which had seemed like wishful thinking when he started carving it, now felt like prophecy fulfilled. "What will we name them?" Jeremiah asked. "Something strong, something that speaks of this place and this life we've chosen." Cordelia looked out over the wilderness that had become her paradise, thinking of the legacy they were creating, not in boardrooms and bank accounts, but in love and blood and the continuation of something beautiful, something that will remind them they were born from courage and raised on hope. The telegram lay forgotten at their feet, its grim news already irrelevant. They had lost a fortune and gained a future, traded an empire for a family, exchanged the temporary power of wealth for the eternal strength of love. In the distance, an eagle soared above the peaks, its cry echoing off the mountains like a song of celebration. 6 months later, As spring painted the mountains in shades of green Cordelia had never imagined possible, she stood in the garden beside their expanded cabin, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their son moved with the restless energy that had characterized him since the moment of conception. The transformation had been complete and perfect. Where once stood the solitary hermit's dwelling, now there was a true homestead, rooms added with careful craftsmanship to accommodate their growing family, a larger garden that would feed them through the coming winter, and touches of feminine grace that softened the cabin's rough edges without diminishing its fundamental harmony with the wilderness around it. The family Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its pages crisp and new, purchased from the traveling preacher who had blessed their union and would soon return to baptize their child. On the first page, in Jeremiah's careful script, was recorded their marriage. Below it, space waited for the birth they both anticipated with joy and wonder. "How are you feeling?" Jeremiah asked, emerging from the workshop where he spent his mornings crafting furniture for their expanding home. Wood shavings clung to his hair, and his hands bore the honest stains of his trade. "Strong," she said, and meant it completely. "Stronger than I've ever been." The pregnancy had agreed with her in ways that defied every expectation. Instead of the delicate condition society expected of women her age, she had bloomed like a late flowering plant finally given proper soil and sunlight. Her body, freed from the constraints of corsets and the stress of business battles, had embraced its new purpose with remarkable resilience. Dr. Morrison, the territorial physician who visited monthly to check on her progress, had pronounced her health excellent and her prospects for a safe delivery very good. "Mountain air and honest work," he told them, "better medicine than anything I carry in my bag." The townspeople of Copper Creek had accepted the unusual couple with the kind of pragmatic tolerance that frontier communities extended to anyone who proved their worth through action rather than words. Mrs. Henderson had become a grandmother in all but blood, knitting tiny garments and offering advice with the gentle authority of experience. Bill Hawkins had appointed himself unofficial grandfather, already planning the lessons he would teach the boy about hunting and fishing and reading the mountain weather. But it was the correspondence from New York that had provided the most unexpected blessing. Word of Cordelia's dramatic transformation had spread through business circles like wildfire. The shipping heiress, who had abandoned everything for love, had become a legend of sorts, inspiring both admiration and disbelief in equal measure. More importantly, it had inspired several former employees to seek them out. These were men and women who had worked in her enterprises, who had found themselves unemployed when the empire collapsed, but who remembered her fairness and her genuine concern for their welfare. "Ma'am," the first letter had read, "word is you've found happiness in the Colorado Territory. Some of us were thinking if there's work to be had in your new home, we'd be honored to join you there. We know you always treated us right, and we'd like the chance to help build whatever you're building now." The response had been immediate and generous. Jeremiah's carpentry skills, combined with Cordelia's organizational abilities and their shared vision of a community built on mutual support rather than exploitation, had created opportunities she'd never expected. They had started small, a trading post that served the growing number of settlers drawn to the valley, a lumber operation that harvested timber sustainably, a guide service for wealthy Easterners seeking authentic mountain experiences. Within months, what had been an isolated hermitage had become the nucleus of a thriving settlement. Families arrived monthly, drawn by letters home that spoke of fair wages, honest work, and a way of life that honored both individual achievement and community support. "You've built another empire," Jeremiah had teased her just the week before, watching as she organized the construction of a schoolhouse that would serve the settlement's growing number of children. "Not an empire," she'd corrected. "A home, a place where people can build lives worth living." Now, as their son moved restlessly in her womb, she felt the truth of those words more deeply than ever. This wasn't about conquest or accumulation, or the endless pursuit of more. This was about creating something that would endure, not because it was profitable, but because it was good. The silver locket still hung around her neck, her mother's face hidden but somehow present, approving. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Cordelia found herself speaking to that faded image, sharing news of the grandchild who would never know her, but would carry her genes and her capacity for love forward into a new century. As evening approached and the western peaks began to glow with alpenglow, Jeremiah joined her in the garden, his arms slipping around her expanded waist with protective tenderness. Their friends and neighbors moved through the settlement around them, families tending their own gardens, children playing games that echoed off the surrounding mountains, men and women building lives that would outlast any corporate empire. "Do you ever miss it?" Jeremiah asked, though he already knew the answer. "The power, the money, the sense that you could change the world with a single decision?" Cordelia smiled, watching a young woman teach her daughter to identify edible plants while her husband split wood for their winter supply. In the distance, smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and lanterns began to twinkle in windows as families gathered for evening meals. "I am changing the world," she said softly, her hand moving to where their son stirred with life and promise. "One heart at a time, one life at a time, one generation at a time. The difference is that now I'm building something that can't be bought or sold or stolen, something that will live long after we're both gone." As if summoned by her words, their son kicked vigorously against her ribs, announcing his eagerness to join the world they were creating. Cordelia laughed and pressed Jeremiah's hand to the spot, sharing the miracle of new life stirring within her. The walls she had spent 58 years building around her heart had not just crumbled, they had been transformed into bridges. Bridges that connected her to this man who had seen past her wealth to her soul, to this community that valued character over capital, to this child who would inherit not money, but something far more precious. The knowledge that love, freely given and courageously claimed, could indeed conquer all.